This presentation will seek to provide information around the documentation requirements for R&D claims that may be sought in the event of a review of a company's claim by the ATO. The presentation has been based on an ATO guidance publication titled Keeping Records and Calculating Your Notional Deductions, which is available on the ATO's website. Substantiation of the incurrence of R&D expenditure and its nexus with registered R&D activities has been a large focus for ATO compliance reviews over recent years. Additional funding for compliance reviews of R&D tax submissions was announced in the May 2018 federal budget, which means ATO reviews of R&D claims are more likely to occur. Companies should accordingly take steps to thoroughly review their R&D expenditure positions and eligibility before submission to ensure they have suitable documentation to support their claims in the event of a review. When collating an R&D claim, a company is required to have additional records beyond the general reports maintained for their ordinary business tax purposes. When lodging an R&D claim, a company must keep records that show how R&D expenditure incurred relates to the R&D activities registered with AusIndustry, as described in their application, how the company may have apportioned expenditure between eligible R&D activities and ineligible R&D activities, that the R&D activities were undertaken on the R&D company's own behalf and not for another entity, incurrence and payment of expenditure, particularly if the expenditure was incurred by an associate entity, and also how adjustments have been calculated that may arise if the R&D entity receives a grant and is liable for a clawback adjustment, or if feedstock input R&D expenditure produces a marketable product, triggering a feedstock adjustment. R&D expenditure is only eligible to the extent that it is incurred on R&D activities. A company must show how R&D expenditure reported in their tax return has been incurred on the specific R&D activities registered with AusIndustry. During a review, the ATO would be likely to seek records to show how each item of R&D expenditure relates to the specific R&D activities within their application. Administrative costs and overheads may be incurred on R&D activities if there is a direct link between the R&D activities and the expenditure incurred. Ineligible expenses are those without sufficient link to the R&D activities registered, particularly if they relate to general company operations or marketing expenditure. The ATO's position is that expenditure that would be incurred regardless of the R&D activities being undertaken is not eligible for the R&D tax incentive. Salary expenditure can often be a major component of a company's R&D claim, and records are required to justify how R&D salaries have been calculated. The ATO have increased their expectations around documentation of R&D salaries in recent years. Companies must substantiate the time spent on eligible R&D projects by their employees who carried out the registered activities is reasonable and documented. The ATO's view is that the most accurate and effective method of allocating time to R&D activities is to maintain timesheets or job cards. The ATO's position is that if you don't use such methods, it may be more difficult to show that the allocation of R&D time is accurate. In the ATO's guidance, they do however acknowledge that it may not always be practical to retain timesheets or job cards, and if so, a summary sheet may be acceptable if it provides sufficient information. ATO compliance reviews of R&D claims often reference the principles in the ozone manufacturing AAT case, which determine that a company must have records that show the time spent on R&D activities by their own employees on specific dates, and also how work performed daily related to the specific R&D activities registered. Where R&D activity is undertaken by an external contractor, records must be available which demonstrate that the contract expenditure has a nexus to the registered R&D activity. Records for contract R&D expenditure must show the date R&D activities are undertaken by the relevant contractor, sufficient detail to ascertain the amount of expenditure incurred on the R&D activity by the contractor, as opposed to other goods or services being provided under the contract. Such records may include the contract, invoices, or evidence of work carried out by the contractor, such as project reports or schedules. The ATO would also seek evidence of the contractual terms which support that ownership of the results of the R&D activity belong to the R&D entity rather than the invoicing contractor, and also that the R&D entity bared the financial risk of the R&D project and made key project decisions. Other direct expenditure that a company may seek to claim, such as feedstock materials or depreciation on R&D assets, must be supported by records which show the specific registered R&D activity that the R&D expenditure item relates to, evidence of incurrence such as tax invoices and bank statements, and also records around the marketable sale or value of R&D inputs where a feedstock adjustment may be required. Some types of R&D expenditure incurred may relate to both R&D and non-R&D activities. The ATO guidance acknowledges that it may be difficult to examine each invoice to calculate the amount of R&D expenditure applicable to the relevant R&D activity, and that a company may need to apportion an expense in such a case. Whilst apportionment is allowed by the ATO, the basis and methods of apportionments for R&D expenditure has been scrutinised in recent years. The ATO requires that companies carefully review to ensure that the appropriate basis of apportionment is determined for each expenditure type based on all of the following considerations: the type of R&D activities being conducted, how the company is conducting the R&D activities, and also the type of expenditure incurred which is being considered for apportionment. It's important to note that the methods of apportionment used for R&D calculations by tax practitioners over a number of years historically are now no longer likely to be accepted by the ATO. A previous ruling, IT 2552, was in effect under the old R&D tax concession, and it has been withdrawn a number of years ago now. The ATO specifically does not accept the guidance in this ruling to be relevant to the current R&D tax incentive. The previous IT 2552 ruling allowed for a single basis of apportionment, whereby a ratio of R&D salaries over total salaries was acceptable. The previous ruling also provided a list of expenditure classifications that would generally be accepted as connected to eligible R&D projects, such as cleaning, electricity, insurance, postage, printing, rent, and telephone costs. The ATO specifically do not accept a uniform basis of apportionment for R&D expenditure under the R&D tax incentive, and the old principles within the previous IT 2552 ruling must no longer be applied. The ATO's current guidance on apportionment methods for expenditure under the R&D tax incentive do not include definitive formulas or methods, but rather provide for general principles. Some of these principles noted are as follows. For expenditure incurred over a period of use, such as electricity or the decline in value of R&D assets, an apportionment based on the time spent of employees on R&D activities over total company employees may be more appropriate than an apportionment based on the dollar value of R&D salaries. Also, for expenses such as rates, land taxes, rent or lease costs, which are mainly for the area used in R&D activities, an apportionment based on the area of use in R&D activity may be appropriate. The current guidance for apportionment states that an apportionment basis of R&D salaries over total company salaries, as per the previous IT 2552, will only be considered reasonable where the expenditure being apportioned is based on how much an employee earns, such as apportionments for payments of super or workers' compensation. That concludes this presentation on substantiation of R&D expenditure. Should you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with our office. There is also additional material available on our website, as well as the website of the ATO and Oz Industry. Thank you.